Norman Ollestad saw the tree limb reach out of the fog and disappear. Then another one. Then another. He was 11 years old, sitting in the back of a Cessna 72, watching gray clouds press against the windows like they were trapped inside a box. And then 3 thuds. The third one knocked him unconscious. It was February 19, 1979. Norman was on his way to Big Bear Mountain with his father, Norman Ollestad Sr., to pick up a trophy. Norman had just won the Southern California Slalom Skiing Championship at age 11. His father called him Boy Wonder. This flight was supposed to be a celebration. 30 minutes, maybe 45. Easy. Norman's father had chartered the small plane, and they'd taken off from the Santa Monica airport that morning. Also on board his father's girlfriend Sandra and the pilot Rob Arnold. Norman's father wasn't just any dad. He was a former FBI agent, a surfer, a lawyer, a musician, and an adventurer who had spent the last 8 years turning his son into an athlete. From the time Norman was 3 years old, his father had dragged him into the ocean to surf massive waves. He'd strapped skis on him and thrown him down black diamond slopes. He'd woken him up at 5 a.m. to play hockey when Norman just wanted to sleep. Norman resented it. He wanted to ride bikes with friends, go to birthday parties, eat chocolate cake and watch TV. But his father didn't care. "You're going to live life," he'd say, "not watch it." The plane hit Ontario Peak at 8,600 feet in the middle of a blizzard. The wing clipped a tree, and the Cessna flipped, smashing into the frozen mountainside. Norman felt those 3 thuds in his spine, a sickening crunch, and then everything went black. When he woke up, the first thing he noticed was the cold. It was so cold his lungs hurt when he breathed. Snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. The plane was twisted wreckage, scattered across the slope like a broken toy. Norman crawled out of the debris, his face cut and bleeding, his wrist throbbing. And then he saw his father. Norman Ollestad Sr. was lying face down in the snow, his body crumpled at an unnatural angle. Norman shook him. "Dad, Dad, wake up." No response. His father's eyes were open, staring at nothing. Norman screamed. He kept shaking him, begging him to wake up, but his father was gone. Dead on impact. The pilot Rob Arnold was also dead. Sandra was alive, but barely. She had a dislocated shoulder and a severe head injury. She was dazed, confused, mumbling incoherently. Norman was the only one who was functional, an 11-year-old boy, alone on a mountain, in a blizzard, at 8,600 feet. But here's what Norman didn't know yet. His father had been preparing him for this moment his entire life. For 7 hours, Norman and Sandra huddled under the plane's wing, hoping someone would come, but no one did. The storm was getting worse, the temperature was dropping. Norman realized that if they stayed there they would freeze to death. He told Sandra they had to move. She didn't want to go. She was hurt, terrified, in shock. But Norman insisted. "We have to go down," he said. "We're not going to make it through the night up here." Norman helped Sandra stand. They began the descent. The mountainside was a sheet of ice. Every step was treacherous. Norman used the techniques his father had taught him while skiing. Keep your weight forward, dig your edges in, control your speed. But this wasn't a ski slope. This was a survival descent. One wrong move and they'd slide off the mountain. They made it about 100 yards before Sandra slipped. She fell into an ice chute, a narrow, steep channel carved into the mountain by water. Norman watched her tumble, faster and faster, until she disappeared into the fog. He screamed her name. No answer. Sandra was gone. Norman never saw her alive again. Now pay attention to this part, because this is where an 11-year-old boy had to make a decision no child should ever make. Norman could sit down and wait to die, or he could keep going, alone. He chose to go. His father's voice was in his head. "Never give up, Boy Wonder. You know how to deal with mountains. You just have to go down." Norman started moving. He had no gloves. His hands were raw and bleeding from grabbing onto ice and rock. He slid on his butt down steep sections, his skin tearing, his fingers going numb. The blizzard was so thick he could barely see 5 feet in front of him. But he kept going. Every time Norman wanted to stop, every time the cold became unbearable, every time fear threatened to paralyze him, he heard his father's voice. Don't look back. Keep moving. You're tougher than you think. And Norman was tough. He'd been surfing 10-foot waves since he was 5. He'd been racing downhill at 40 miles per hour since he was 7. His father had pushed him to his breaking point 100 times, and every time Norman had survived. But wait, here's where it gets even more unbelievable. Norman wasn't just navigating down a mountain in a blizzard. He was doing it with a broken wrist, cuts all over his face, and no winter gear. He was wearing jeans, a jacket, and sneakers. That's it. No gloves. No hat. No survival equipment. Just a scared, freezing, traumatized 11-year-old boy who refused to quit. Hours passed. Norman couldn't feel his hands anymore. He couldn't feel his feet. His body was shutting down from hypothermia. But he kept moving. He slid down ice chutes. He grabbed onto tree roots. He crawled over boulders. He fell. He got up. He fell again. He got up again. Never give up, his father had said. So Norman didn't. The physical pain was constant and overwhelming. Norman's broken wrist throbbed with every movement. His hands were shredded, skin peeled back, knuckles exposed to bone, blood freezing on his fingers. His face burned from the cold and the cuts. His lungs ached from breathing the freezing air. But the worst pain wasn't physical. It was the loneliness. The crushing, suffocating realization that he was completely alone. His father was dead. Sandra was gone. No one was coming to save him. He was on his own. But here's something remarkable about Norman. He didn't panic. His father had trained that out of him. Panic kills, his father used to say while they were surfing big waves. Stay calm. Assess. Move. So that's what Norman did. He assessed the slope. He found the safest route. He moved, one careful step at a time. When the slope got too steep, he sat down and slid. When he couldn't slide, he crawled. When he couldn't crawl, he dragged himself forward on his stomach. At one point, Norman reached a section so icy and steep that there was no way down. The mountain face dropped off into what looked like a sheer cliff. For a moment, Norman thought this was it. This was where he'd die. But then he remembered a technique his father had taught him while skiing moguls. Commit to the fall line. Don't fight it. Use momentum. Norman took a breath, sat down, and let go. He slid down the ice at terrifying speed, completely out of control, unable to He crashed into a snowbank at the bottom, his body slamming into the packed snow so hard it knocked the wind out of him. But he was alive, and he was lower on the mountain. At one point, Norman stopped and looked back up the mountain. He could barely see the crash site through the snow. His father was up there, dead, and Norman realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His father had died trying to give him the best life possible. All those mornings waking up at dawn, all those grueling ski practices, all those terrifying surf sessions. His father hadn't been torturing him, he'd been preparing him. And now, in the cruelest twist imaginable, those lessons were keeping Norman alive. The descent took 9 hours. 9 hours of crawling, sliding, falling, bleeding, freezing. Norman's knuckles were scraped to the bone. His hands looked like ground meat. But he kept going. And then finally, he saw something through the trees. Footprints. Fresh footprints, in the snow. Norman followed them to a dirt road. And then he saw a ranch house. Norman stumbled up to the door and knocked. A teenage boy opened it. He took one look at Norman, covered in blood, shivering uncontrollably, barely able to speak, and yelled for his father. The rancher wrapped Norman in blankets, called for help, and held him while he sobbed. Norman had made it. Against every odd, against every rational expectation, an 11-year-old boy had walked down an 600-foot mountain in a blizzard, alone. Rescuers went back up the mountain to search for Sandra. They found her body the next day. She had died from her injuries and exposure. Norman was treated for hypothermia, a broken wrist, cuts and bruises. Physically, he would recover. Emotionally, that would take decades. But the truly shocking part, Norman didn't hate his father for pushing him. He didn't blame him for the crash. Instead, he spent the rest of his life trying to understand him. In 2009, 30 years after the crash, Norman published a memoir called Crazy for the Storm, a memoir of survival. It became a bestseller. The book wasn't just about the crash. It was about his relationship with his father, a complicated, intense, beautiful, painful bond between a man who demanded everything and a boy who gave it. Norman wrote about surfing in Malibu in the 1970s, about skiing in Mexico, about his parents' divorce, about feeling like he'd lost his childhood. But he also wrote about gratitude. Because without his father's extreme training, Norman would have frozen to death on that mountain. "I wanted to play with kids," Norman said in an interview years later. "I wanted to ride bikes, go to birthday parties, but my dad couldn't understand that. He wanted me to live life." And on February 19, 1979, Norman's father gave him the tools to do exactly that. In 2006, 27 years after the crash, Norman returned to Ontario Peak for the first time. He hiked up the mountain, searching for the crash site, and then he found it, 2 trees with scars from the wing impact. Pieces of the plane were still there, buried in the shale. Norman sat down and cried. He thought about his father. He thought about Sandra. He thought about the scared 11-year-old boy who had somehow survived the impossible. Today Norman lives in Venice, California. He has a son of his own, and yes, he teaches him to surf and ski. But not like his father did. Those were different times, Norman said. He walks a line between responsible parenting and teaching his son the lessons that saved his life. Because Norman knows the truth. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones. The story of Norman Ollestad isn't just about survival. It's about the complicated love between fathers and sons. It's about pushing limits and finding strength you didn't know you had. It's about hearing your father's voice in your head when you're alone and terrified and making the choice to keep going. And it's about the thin line between reckless and prepared. A line that on a frozen mountain in 1979 made all the difference between life and death.